Good evening and welcome to the Sleep to Law series. Tonight we will talk about Red Dragon, the 1981 novel by Thomas Harris, which introduced the world to the terrifying psychiatrist Dr. Hannibal Lecter and the troubled profiler Will Graham. We will explore the dark psychology of the killer known as the Tooth Fairy and the intense manhunt that spans across the country. If you would like, subscribe or comment to let me know you are here. Before we begin, I have a question for you. Do you think that a difficult childhood creates a monster, or is some evil just born that way? Comment your thoughts below, as I would love to read your perspective on nature versus nurture. Now let us transition to the story, The Dragon's Awakening. The human condition is a terrifying paradox. As the poet William Blake observed, the same vessel that holds mercy, pity, and love also contains the forge of cruelty. The human face can be a furnace sealed, and the human heart a hungry gorge. This duality serves as the bleeding edge of our entry into the world of Will Graham, a man cursed with the ability to navigate the darkest corridors of that gorge, only to find that the darkness eventually stares back. Our story opens in the deceptive tranquility of the Florida Keys. Here, the salt-silvered wood of an old house stands against the clear light, a sanctuary for Will Graham, a man trying to outrun his own mind. But peace is a fragile construct when Jack Crawford, a shadowed figure from the FBI, arrives to shatter it. Crawford brings with him the cold reality of the outside world. Two families, the Jacobys in Birmingham and the Leedses in Atlanta, slaughtered in their homes exactly 1 month apart. The killer strikes in phase with the full moon, a lycanthropic rhythm that suggests a primal ritualistic compulsion. Graham is not merely a detective. He is a forensic empath, a vessel who involuntarily absorbs the rhythms and syntax of those around him, including the monsters he hunts. He is reluctant to look at the photographs Crawford offers. He knows that to see the crime is to invite the killer into his head. We learn that Graham carries a physical map of this danger on his body, a looping scar across his stomach, a souvenir from a linoleum knife wielded by the brilliant and psychopathic Dr. Hannibal Lecter. Graham didn't just catch Lecter. He understood him, and that understanding nearly cost him his life. Now, Crawford needs that same cursed imagination to catch a new monster, a phantom the press calls the Tooth Fairy. Despite the protests of his wife Molly, who represents the sanity and human dress Graham desperately clings to, he agrees to assist. He cannot let the cycle continue. The moon is waning, but the clock is ticking toward the next full phase. Graham travels to Atlanta, to the silent wooded lot where the Leeds family died. He insists on visiting the scene at night, alone. This is not standard police procedure. This is a séance. Graham stands in the dark, letting the fear wash over him, using it as a lens to sharpen his senses. He needs to feel the terror the victims felt to reconstruct the mind of their executioner. He enters the house, smelling the lingering scent of furniture polish and the metallic copper tang of blood. He senses the madness in the air, distinct and heavy, like the scent of a predator. As he moves through the house, Graham's mind overlays the violence onto the silent rooms. He visualizes the intruder's entry, the calculated use of a glass cutter and suction cup, the silence of the gloved hand unlocking the door. The killer is comfortable here. He is not a frantic burglar. He is a master of his own terrifying domain. In the master bedroom, the horror comes into focus. The bloodstains tell a story that contradicts the initial police theories. The father, Charles Leeds, was killed first, throat cut while he slept, rendering him helpless to save his family. The mother was shot. But the true pathology of the killer reveals itself in what happened after the deaths. The bodies were moved. The killer didn't just slaughter them, he arranged them. Graham realizes with a sickening jolt that the children were not killed in their beds as they were found. They were brought into the parents' room. They were placed against the wall, dead eyes propped open, facing the bed. They were an audience. The killer performed his atrocities on the mother's body in front of them. He smashed the mirrors in the house, not out of simple vandalism, but to use the jagged shards for unspeakable acts, and perhaps to see his own reflection fragmented in the carnage. This acts as a window into the killer's psyche. He possesses a deep-seated need to be seen, to be acknowledged, perhaps even worshipped by his victims. He's not just killing, he's becoming something else. The investigation moves from the visceral to the clinical, but the horror remains. Graham deduces that the killer, in a moment of perverted intimacy, removed his gloves to touch the mother, Mrs. Leeds. He wanted to feel her skin without the barrier of latex. This slip in discipline provides the first real cracks in the killer's armor. A thumbprint is found on the cornea of one of the dead children, a ghastly detail that underscores the killer's physical proximity to his audience, and a partial palm print is discovered on the mother's leg. Combined with the forensic dentistry, bite marks on the mother, and on a piece of cheese left at the scene, a profile begins to emerge. The killer has snaggle teeth, crooked and notched. He is a biter, but not in the typical sexual sadist manner. There are no suck marks. The bites are aggressive, fighting marks. He is angry, socially awkward, likely an invisible man in his daily life, who transforms into a god of blood under the full moon. The toll on Graham is immediate. In his hotel room, the partition between his mind and the crime dissolves. He wakes up sweating, hallucinating the mutilated body of Mrs. Leeds in the bed beside him. He realizes that the killer's arrangement of the bodies mimics a childhood memory of Graham's own, a display of Cupid dolls in a drugstore window, all staring with focused cornflower blue eyes. The killer needed the family to witness his transformation. The authorities, including the Atlanta police and the medical examiners, are desperate. They hold press conferences, trying to manage the narrative while keeping the Tooth Fairy moniker out of official channels to avoid dignifying the psychopath. We also meet Freddie Lowndes, a parasitic tabloid reporter who previously exploited Graham's trauma with Lecter. Lowndes represents the voyeuristic public, the outside world that consumes tragedy as entertainment, adding another layer of pressure to the investigation. As the narrative coil tightens, Graham sits in a diner with Crawford, the weight of the inevitable pressing down on him. He knows that standard police work, checking files, running prints, might eventually work, but they are racing against the lunar cycle. Crawford asks if there is any other way to catch him. Graham's answer is chilling in its certainty. The killer will not stop. He won't slip up because of guilt or fear. He will continue because he has a genuine taste for it. The dragon has awoken, and until the next full moon rises, Graham must dwell in the darkness of the hungry gorge, waiting for the monster to reveal his face. The red dragon's reflection. The horror of the Tooth Fairy investigation begins not with blood, but with the mundane, the stifling, humid heat of a Georgia summer and the petty grievances of suburbia. In the alleyways behind the manicured lawns of Atlanta, a meter reader named Hoyt Lewis is just trying to eat his lunch. He is interrupted by H.G. Parsons, a cantankerous retiree obsessed with his electric bill and the invasive species of grass in his neighbor's yard. Parsons is a figure of suburban absurdity, complaining about someone else reading his meter, someone unauthorized. This seems like a throwaway moment, a neighborhood dispute, but in the architecture of a nightmare, it is the first crack in the dam. Parsons unknowingly looked into the face of a monster and complained about a utility bill. The killer walks among them in plain sight, camouflaged by a clipboard and a uniform, casing the sanctuary of his victims while the sun is high. Will Graham returns to the Leeds house, the site of the recent slaughter. This is where we see the distinct nature of Graham's curse. He does not just analyze ballistics or blood splatter. He immerses himself in the lost lives of the dead. He moves through the silent house, touching the adult toys, the ski boat, the golf clubs, objects that now possess a tragic obsolescence. He enters the dressing room of Mrs. Leeds. He reads her diary. It is an act of necessary voyeurism that weighs heavily on him. He absorbs her intimacy, her love for her husband, the mundane joys of snow days and Christmas wishes. He watches their home movies in the very chair where Charles Leeds died. He feels the sticky residue of a child's candy on the armrest. This is the psychological toll of Graham's gift. To catch the predator, he must first love the prey. He watches the ghostly flicker of the family playing, bathing, living, and he knows that the eyes which watched them last were not his, but the eyes of the destroyer. The killer didn't just end their lives, he consumed their happiness. The pressure fractures Graham's own composure. He calls his wife, Molly, back in the safety of Florida. It is a desperate reach for reality. The conversation is strained. Graham is terrified of retracting, of pulling his emotions inward to shield himself, a defense mechanism that distances him from the warmth of his own life. He is already slipping into the mindset required to hunt, a mindset that leaves no room for the trivialities of domestic happiness. He fears that by opening his mind to the killer, he is letting a contagion into his own soul. Back in the investigation, the gears of police work begin to grind out a pattern. A report from Birmingham surfaces. A cat found buried in a shoebox, strangled, treated with a bizarre, ritualistic care. It mirrors the death of the Leeds dog. The pattern is established. The killer strikes the pet first, removing the alarm, then takes the family. Graham and Chief Springfield return to the alley to interview Parsons. In the sterile, desperate neatness of the old man's kitchen, a crucial lead emerges. Parsons insists the man he saw wasn't the regular meter reader. He describes a blonde man, pale, who didn't look at the meter but looked through it, casing the house. Parsons, in his senile irritation, had spotted the tooth fairy. This confirms the killer is not a drifter acting on impulse, but a planner who hunts with terrifying patience. He scouts, he plans, he waits. During the drive, the shadow of Hannibal Lecter falls over the conversation. Springfield asks the question that haunts Graham. How did he catch the Chesapeake Ripper? Graham reveals it wasn't a Sherlock Holmes deduction, but a flash of intuitive association. He had seen a diagram in an old medical text called Wound Man, an illustration of various battle injuries. When he saw the sixth victim, he realized the injuries matched the diagram perfectly. It was an aesthetic recognition, not a forensic one. Lecter wasn't just killing, he was creating art from agony. Graham caught him because he recognized the doctor's twisted scholarship. It was a stroke of luck, and Graham hates himself for it because luck is not a strategy you can rely on twice. Desperation mounts. The full moon is approaching. Graham knows he needs to recover a specific mindset, a way of thinking that is alien to decent men. He needs to check his own intellect against a master of madness. Against his better judgment, he decides he must visit the anchor that drags on his soul, Dr. Hannibal Lecter. The Chesapeake State Hospital for the Criminally Insane is a fortress of drab institutional colors and heavy steel. Dr. Chilton, the administrator, is a man of petty ego and incompetence, a stark contrast to the monster he keeps. Chilton offers a chilling anecdote to illustrate Lecter's nature. During a medical exam, Lecter had attacked a nurse, tearing out her tongue. The terrifying detail isn't the violence, but the physiology. Throughout the attack, Lecter's pulse never rose above 85. He is a creature of absolute zero, a man without the biological capacity for fear or empathy. Graham walks the corridor. The atmosphere changes. The air seems to thin. He approaches the cell, heavily barred and netted. Lecter is asleep, a picture of tranquility, a book on his chest. But the doctor is never truly asleep. He wakes instantly, his senses predatory. He smells Graham, identifying the cheap aftershave Graham wears only because it was a gift. The mind games begin immediately. Lecter is not impressed by the file Graham brings. He is more interested in tormenting Graham, poking at the scars on his psyche. He mocks Graham's fear, his layman status, and the very act of coming to him for help. But beneath the taunts, Lecter offers a devastating insight into the Tooth Fairy's pathology. He notes that the killer smashes mirrors not just to destroy them, but to use the shards. He positions the jagged pieces to see himself. The killer needs an audience, even if that audience is his own reflection in the ruins of a family's life. Lecter also points out a missing detail in the police files, the lack of information on the backyards. He hypothesizes that the killer, a worshipper of the moon, likely takes the victims outside or views them in the moonlight. Have you seen blood in the moonlight, Will? It appears quite black. It is a statement of horrifying aesthetic appreciation. Graham flees the encounter, his mind reeling. He leaves the file with Lecter, a deal with the devil for information. As he walks away, the steel door closing between them, Lecter delivers the final poisoning blow, the words that Graham fears most because he suspects they are true. The reason you caught me is that we're just alike. Graham steps out into the sunlight, but the chill remains. He is numb, his heart drumming like a bird against a cage. He feels as though Lecter has walked out with him, a passenger in his mind. Across the street, the lens of a tabloid camera snaps his picture, capturing a man standing under the asylum's stone inscription, looking less like a detective and more like a patient who has momentarily found the door. The Dragon's correspondence. In the silence of the Chesapeake State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, Dr. Hannibal Lecter constructs a world within his mind. Deprived of stimulation, locked away from the sensory richness of the outside world, he navigates the corridors of his memory palace. He conjures textures and scents, the phantom aroma of chili down the hall, the sharp, bitter smell of weeds associated with Will Graham. It is a terrifying testament to his intellect that he requires no external reality to be dangerous. His mind is a self-sustaining engine of precision, yet boredom is an enemy even he must parry. After Graham's departure, Lecter decides to reach out, not to help, but to acquire leverage. He plays the asylum staff like instruments, feigning cooperation to gain access to a telephone. With a guard standing by with mace, Lecter performs a masterclass in social engineering. He dials the University of Chicago, posing as a bewildered publisher needing to send a book to Will Graham. He manipulates a secretary's helpful nature, bypassing security protocols with charming banter until he extracts the prize. Will Graham's home address in Marathon, Florida. It is a chilling victory. While the FBI believes Lecter is contained, he has just stripped away the anonymity that protects the man who caught him. He considers sending Graham a colostomy bag as a twisted housewarming gift, a reminder of the gut wound Graham suffered at his hands. 700 miles away, the narrative shifts to the stark, fluorescent reality of Francis Dolarhyde. We find him in the cafeteria of a St. Louis film laboratory, a man defined by his isolation. Dolarhyde is a creature of the dark, both in his profession as a film developer and in his soul. He wears red-tinted goggles shielding his eyes, just as he shields his psyche from the mundane world. When a female co-worker, Eileen, approaches him to apologize for a drunken colleague's mockery, we see the tragic architecture of Dolarhyde's loneliness. He struggles to speak, ashamed of a cleft palate that turns his S sounds into a struggle, forcing him to avoid words like yes or stopped. He's trapped in a body he despises, mistaking Eileen's basic human decency for pity, or worse, blindness to his true nature. He retreats to the family home, a large, decaying house in the middle of an apple orchard. The setting is ripe with Gothic symbolism, the smell of rotting fruit, the buzzing of bees, and the interior of the house preserved as a shrine to his dead grandmother. It is a mausoleum of trauma. Her false teeth still sit in a glass by the bed, the water long evaporated, a potent totem of the woman who shaped his madness. Dolarhyde's ritual of returning home is methodical. He checks every room, ensuring his solitude. But he is not truly alone. He is accompanied by the great red dragon. In his bedroom, dominated by a reproduction of William Blake's painting, The Great Red Dragon and the Woman Clothed with the Sun, Dolarhyde begins his transformation. He does not view himself as a mere murderer. He is in a state of becoming. The violence is a chrysalis. He sets up a projector in the parlor, creating a sensory deprivation tank of his own making, complete with a rotating light machine that casts swirling galaxies across the walls. He projects the home movies of the families he has slaughtered. This is the voyeurism of the predator. We watch him watch the Leeds family. He critiques the footage, not with remorse, but with the eye of a director dissatisfied with a performance. He sees his own intrusion into their lives as a divine act, yet he laments the clumsiness of his physical form during the kills. He yearns for the grace of the dragon. The film reveals his modus operandi. He controls the environment, arranging the bodies, touching the dead, seeking to absorb their lives to fuel his own radiance. It is a horrifying intimacy. He believes he is elevating these suburban families by turning them into fuel for his ascension. Meanwhile, Will Graham is in the air, flying toward the site of the first massacre in Birmingham. He is a hunter who hates the hunt, burdened by the weight of empathy. He reviews the files of the Jacobi family, searching for the connection, the why. Mass murder is rarely random, and Graham knows the killer saw something in these families that triggered his need. The similarities are superficial, house layout, demographics, but the differences are maddening. Graham arrives at the Jacobi house, now a sterile shell stripped of life. He walks the grounds, forcing his mind to synchronize with the killers. He finds the spot where the family cat was buried, a small tragedy that preceded the greater one. Graham realizes the killer didn't just stumble upon the house, he stalked it. He watched the children bury their pet. This insight into the killer's patience is disturbing. The Tooth Fairy, as the press calls him, is not an impulsive slasher. He is a watcher. Pushing into the woods behind the house, Graham searches for the vantage point. He finds it in a tree, a predator's nest overlooking the home. There, carved into the bark of a high limb, is a symbol. It is not graffiti, it is a claim. A Chinese character later identified by experts as a symbol for the red dragon, or a mahjong tile meaning you hit it on the head. It is a mark of luck, or perhaps a signature left for a god only the killer sees. Back in St. Louis, the two worlds, the dragons and the hunters, begin to converge through the medium of the tabloid press. Dolarhyde reads the National Tatler, seeing the article about Graham consulting Lecter. The headline, "Insane Fiend Consulted," enrages him, not because of the moral judgment, but because the press refers to him as the Tooth Fairy. To a man who believes he is evolving into a mythological entity, such a name is a vulgar insult. However, the article sparks a dangerous synapse in Dolarhyde's mind. He sees Hannibal Lecter not as a rival, but as a peer, perhaps the only other being on Earth capable of understanding the grandeur of his becoming. He feels a kinship with the Doctor, believing they are both superior beings, surrounded by crude, uncomprehending sheep. Dolarhyde composes a letter to Lecter. He writes it on toilet paper, a practical measure, as it dissolves quickly if he needs to swallow it to destroy evidence. The letter is a grotesque mixture of fan mail and philosophical treatise. He expresses admiration for Lecter and disdain for the unfair reviews of the press. He hints at his work, the transformation he is undergoing, and asks for Lecter's validation. He signs it not with a name, but with an action. He bites the paper, leaving the impression of his jagged, distinctive teeth as a seal. It is a gesture of primal dominance and intimacy. The discovery of this note triggers a frantic response within the FBI. A cleaning man at the asylum finds the wad of paper in Lecter's cell. Jack Crawford, the head of the Behavioral Science Unit, mobilizes the full weight of federal forensics. They descend on the note with lasers and chemical fumes. The desperation is palpable. They have a physical link between the two most dangerous minds in the hemisphere. Technicians work against the clock. They find no fingerprints, a testament to Dolarhyde's caution, but they find invisible writing hidden in the torn edges of the paper. The message is incomplete, but the method of reply is deciphered. Lecter is to communicate with his avid fan through the personal columns of the National Tatler. The implications are catastrophic. Lecter, the manipulator, has established a dialogue with the active serial killer Graham is hunting. The asylum walls have been breached not by force, but by the intellectual communion of monsters. Graham now faces a war on two fronts: the dragon who slaughters families in the night, and the cannibal who whispers from his cell, orchestrating chaos for his own amusement. The dragon has reached out, and the devil is ready to answer. The pilgrim's bait. The heat of Washington, D.C. is a physical weight, a shimmering oppression that distorts the air around the J. Edgar Hoover building. To Will Graham, returning to this concrete cage feels less like a homecoming and more like re-entering a quarantine zone. He is a man, walking back into the fire he barely survived once, carrying nothing but a flight bag and a heavy heart. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that settles into the bones of a man who knows a killer is thinking about him, a psychic link that feels less like intuition and more like contamination. Jack Crawford meets him, and the bureaucracy of the FBI, hastily issued credentials, magnetic tags, feels almost absurd against the backdrop of the horror they are chasing. They move through the white corridors, the sterility of the environment clashing with the messy, bloody reality of the Tooth Fairy's crimes. The investigation is in a frantic, reactive state. They've played a dangerous game with Hannibal Lecter, faking a plumbing disaster to search his cell, desperate to intercept the communication between the two monsters. The forensic results on the note found in Lecter's cell are a testament to the Tooth Fairy's terrifying discipline. The note, written on toilet tissue, offers tantalizingly little. The paper is Wedeker brand, a common type found in marine heads and motorhomes, distributed nationwide, a clue that leads everywhere and nowhere. The killer wore gloves. The only biological trace is a microscopic whisker and grains of a commercial cleaner with chlorine, likely from the cleaning staff at the asylum, not the killer himself. It creates a picture of a phantom, a man who exists in the negative space of evidence. He is disciplined, careful, and utterly devoted to his craft. However, the handwriting analysis offers a glimpse into the fractured mind of the dragon. The block printing is deliberate, executed with the left hand by a right-handed man, a forced disguise that betrays an uncorrected astigmatism. He is adapting, hiding his true nature, even in his pen strokes. But the most chilling discovery comes from the back of the note, where faint impressions of numbers, 666, reveal a code. It is a communication system, a lifeline between the aspiring god and his mentor. The FBI's plan is risky, bordering on reckless. They intend to use the National Tatler, a tabloid rag, to communicate with the Tooth Fairy. They want to bait him, to manipulate his vanity and his curiosity. But Lecter, the grandmaster of psychological warfare, has already made his move. The code in the ad, a series of book, chapter, and verse references, is cracked not by a theologian, but by the realization that the killer isn't using a Bible. The references are to the joy of cooking. It is a dark, domestic irony, a book of sustenance used to facilitate slaughter. The decoded message is a hammer blow to Graham's fragile world. It does not offer philosophy or praise. It offers an address. Graham's address. Graham Home Marathon, Florida. Save yourself. Kill them all. In that moment, the abstract horror becomes specifically, terrifyingly personal. Lecter hasn't just communicated, he has aimed the weapon. The sanctity of Graham's retreat, the life he built with Molly and her son Willie to escape the darkness, is shattered. The panic is immediate. The evacuation of his family is not just a tactical necessity. It is a frantic attempt to outrun a shadow that has suddenly grown long enough to reach Florida. Graham moves them to a safe house, a cottage on the Chesapeake belonging to Crawford's brother. It is a picturesque setting, whitewashed and blooming with impatience. But for Graham, it is a fortress of solitude and guilt. He has brought this darkness upon them. The psychological toll is evident when he has to explain his past to Willie. The boy, corrupted by the sensationalist trash in the Tatler shown to him by a friend, asks the question that haunts Graham himself. Did he kill a man? Graham's confession to the boy is a masterclass in the burden of truth. He recounts the death of Garrett Hobbs, not as a heroic triumph, but as a mechanical, ugly necessity. He describes the blood, the screaming, the absolute failure of negotiation. He strips away the glamour of the FBI profiler mythos and leaves only the raw trauma of stopping a monster who was cutting his own daughter's throat. It is an admission that violence, even righteous violence, leaves a stain that never washes out. He admits to the depression, the hospitalization, the total collapse of his self. He is teaching the boy that the world is not safe, and that the protectors are just as damaged as the victims. But the most jarring transformation occurs on the firing range. Graham takes Molly, his warm, baseball-loving wife, and teaches her how to kill. He puts a .44 Bulldog revolver in her hand, a short, ugly weapon modified for violence. He doesn't have her shoot standard rounds. He loads it with Glaser safety slugs, projectiles designed to explode in flesh to create wounds that are instantly incapacitating. Watching Molly fire, watching her absorb the recoil and the intent, is a tragic loss of innocence. She is no longer just a wife. She is a sentry, hardened by the necessity of survival. Graham watches her with a look of irrevocable loss, mourning the peace he has been forced to steal from her. Back in Washington, the trap is set. The FBI waits for a phone call from the Pilgrim, the codename Lecter used for the Tooth Fairy. The tension in the surveillance room is palpable. They are hunting a ghost, waiting for him to reach out from the static. When the call finally comes, the voice is muffled, arrogant, toying with Graham. The caller taunts him, claiming knowledge of the crimes, playing a game of cat and mouse. But the twist is pathetic rather than terrifying. The caller is not the Red Dragon. It is Freddie Lowndes, the sleazy reporter for the Tatler. Lowndes is a different kind of predator, a bottom feeder who thrives on the misery of others. He has intercepted the mail, figured out the code, and inserted himself into the investigation for a scoop. His arrogance is boundless, his morality non-existent. He represents the public's morbid fascination, the voyeurism that empowers killers like the Tooth Fairy. Graham's rage at Lowndes is incandescent. This man has risked lives for a headline. But Crawford, ever the pragmatist, sees an opportunity. He strong-arms Lowndes, threatening him with imprisonment, effectively turning the parasite into a tool. Lowndes, realizing he is cornered, flips with the ease of a man who believes in nothing but his own survival. He agrees to help. He agrees to be the medium through which they will provoke the dragon. We get a glimpse into the sad, sordid history of Freddie Lowndes, a man who realized early on that he would never be a respected journalist, that he was destined for the gutter, and so he decided to become the king of the rats. He found his home at the Tatler, peddling cancer cures and misery to the desperate. He is a man who measures his worth in readership numbers and the envy of the legitimate press who despise him. His ambition is a hunger that blinds him to the danger he is courting. He drives his Lincoln Versailles, smelling of cheap cigars and hair tonic, believing he has outsmarted the FBI, unaware that he is walking into the jaws of a beast he cannot comprehend. The strategy Crawford and Graham devise is psychological warfare of the highest order. They consult with Dr. Alan Bloom, a psychiatrist who understands the fragility of the killer's ego. Bloom posits that the Tooth Fairy is driven by a profound sense of inadequacy, that his becoming is a compensation for a life of humiliation. To draw him out, they must attack that ego. They must deny him his glory. They decide to paint the Tooth Fairy not as a terrifying demon, but as a pervert, an impotent failure, a fairy. They will use Lowndes and the Tattler to publish a profile that strips the dragon of his power. Graham will go on record, using his reputation to lend weight to the insults. He will call the killer an ugly, incestuous product of a broken home, a man who is sexually pathetic. It is a dangerous gambit. They are spitting in the face of a god, daring him to strike. Dr. Bloom warns them of the risks. He explains that Graham's greatest asset, his pure empathy, his ability to assume the point of view of the killer, is also his greatest vulnerability. Graham absorbs the fear and the sickness of the minds he hunts. Perception is a tool pointed at both ends, and every time Graham uses it, he impales himself. Crawford knows this, admits that he is using Graham, that he is leveraging Graham's fear and his guilt to catch the killer. It is a cold calculus, one that weighs one man's sanity against the lives of future families. The preparations for the trap are meticulous and grim. They set up a fake safe house for Graham, a Washington hideaway that they will plaster all over the tabloid. They stage photos of Graham looking tired and obsessed, studying a ridiculous artist's conception of the killer. They ensure the location is identifiable to a diligent hunter. They are setting Graham up as the sacrificial goat, tethered in the clearing, waiting for the tiger. Graham's participation in this charade is a heavy burden. He sits for the interview with Lowndes, spewing lies that taste like ash in his mouth. He puts his hand on Lowndes' shoulder for a photo, a gesture of camaraderie that makes him feel unclean. He is entering the mud with the pigs, hoping that he can wrestle the biggest one into submission before he drowns. As the trap is laid, Graham visits his family one last time. The domestic scene is heartbreakingly fragile. They buy groceries, they choose melons, they listen to Pachelbel's canon. It is a beautiful, terrifying normal. Graham lies to Molly, telling her he is going to Birmingham, shielding her from the reality that he is about to offer himself up as bait. He watches her with the desperate intensity of a man memorizing a face he fears he may never see again. The fear flickers over him like a shadow. He knows, with the certainty of a man who has looked into the abyss, that this happiness is too good to survive the darkness that is coming. Meanwhile, in the vast, indifferent mechanism of the world, the dragon begins to stir. In St. Louis, at a sterile airport newsstand, a pair of black zippered boots approaches. The man attached to them is a force of nature, a vessel of contained rage. He intimidates the newsstand operator not with shouting, but with a terrifying predatory stillness. He buys the Tattler, the paper still warm from the bundle. He is drawn to it, to the message he believes awaits him. This is Francis Dolarhyde. He is not just a killer. He is a man in the process of a metamorphosis. He takes the paper back to his sanctuary, a house that is a temple to his madness. He decodes the message, but it is the physical ritual that reveals the depth of his delusion. In the basement of his home, amidst the smell of earth and mildew, Dolarhyde prepares. He uncovers an old oak wheelchair, a relic of a nursing home. He oils the wheels, tending to the machine with a lover's care. The squeak of the wheels is silenced, replaced by a smooth, deadly hum. He is preparing a vessel for his wrath. On his desk, the great journal lies open. The painting of the great red dragon dominates the space, a totem of the power he craves. He pastes the clippings from the Tattler into the book, documenting his interaction with the world. But it is the plastic bag attached to the page that speaks of the horror to come. It is empty, waiting. The label reads, "With these, he offended me." It is a chilling promise of retribution. Dolarhyde is not merely reacting, he is preparing a ritualistic punishment. The mundane object, the wheelchair, is elevated to an instrument of terror. As he spins the wheels in the silence of his kitchen, humming a tune that only he can hear, we understand the true nature of the threat. The FBI is playing a game of psychological chess with a man who believes he is evolving into a deity. They are trying to humiliate a man who has spent a lifetime building a fortress of rage to protect himself from humiliation. The trap is set, the bait is placed, the players are in position. Graham, the reluctant hunter, stands exposed in the glare of the media. Lowndes, the greedy catalyst, thinks he has secured the story of a lifetime. And in the dark, the dragon spins his wheels, preparing to roll out of the nightmare and into the waking world. The collision is inevitable, and it will be catastrophic. The silence of the house in St. Louis is not empty. It is heavy with the breath of the beast, waiting for the moon to rise. The dragon's becoming. Freddie Lowndes left the offices of the National Tatler, feeling the unique intoxication of fatigue and arrogance. He had spun a web of lies for the sake of the investigation, but his mind was already calculating the book deal, the fame, the money waiting on the other side of the Tooth Fairy case. He believed himself to be the puppet master of this narrative, unaware that in the grand design of the killer, he was merely raw material. Lowndes viewed his work with cynical detachment, but the man waiting for him in the parking garage possessed a fervor that bordered on the holy. When the trap sprung, it was banal and brutal. A dispute over a parking space, a sudden blow, and the suffocating sweetness of chloroform. This is the terrifying fragility of safety. One moment you are planning your future. The next, you are bound to an antique wheelchair in a stranger's parlor, glued fast with epoxy. Francis Dolarhyde, the man the world called a monster, had brought the reporter home not just for torture, but for a sermon. Lowndes awoke in a world of sensory deprivation and pain, bonded to the chair like a permanent fixture. When Dolarhyde finally revealed himself, it wasn't a chaotic confrontation, but a structured ritual. He demanded awe. Lowndes had called him a perverted sexual failure in the press, a slug. Dolarhyde, wearing the kimono and the terrifying false teeth, needed to correct the record. He forced Lowndes to look at the slides, the captured moments of the Jacoby and Leeds families, alive, then dead, then transformed. This is the crux of Dolarhyde's psychosis. He does not see murder. He sees a becoming. He believes he is elevating these families into something divine, and by witnessing it, Lowndes is forced into the congregation. The psychological dominance here is absolute. Dolarhyde forces Lowndes to recant his humanity, asking if he, the reporter, is a man. When Lowndes affirms it, Dolarhyde scoffs. To the dragon, being a man is a limitation. He has evolved into something other. The terror culminates in a grotesque act of censorship. After recording Lowndes' forced confession, Dolarhyde leans in with a lover's intimacy and bites the reporter's lips off. It is a symbolic castration of the mouth. The liar can no longer speak clearly. The glib reporter is stripped of his primary tool. The disposal of Freddie Lowndes was a piece of theater designed for Will Graham. In the grey dawn of Chicago, Dolarhyde rolled the wheelchair-bound, gasoline-soaked reporter toward his own tabloid office. He didn't just kill him, he turned him into a message. Lowndes was set ablaze, rolling down the pavement in a chariot of fire, his arms rising in the stiffening, pugilistic reaction of burning muscle. It was a visual scream, a declaration of war against those who would trivialize the dragon's work. Will Graham arrived too late, greeted only by the charred aftermath and the clinical sterility of the burn unit. The guilt was immediate and crushing. Lowndes' dying words, croaked through a destroyed throat, were an accusation. "Graham set me up." This is the burden Graham carries, the knowledge that his empathy, his ability to think like the killer, inevitably turns those around him into bait. As the investigation churned on, analyzing paint chips and wheelchair tracks, Graham found himself isolated. His wife, Molly, unable to bear the proximity to such darkness, took her son and fled to Oregon. Graham was left alone in the rain, drinking to numb the fear, staring at his own reflection until it blurred into the face of the killer. He whispered into the void, acknowledging their bond. "It's you and me now, sport." But to truly understand the monster, one must look backward, past the fire and the blood, to the creation of the man. The horror of Francis Dolarhyde did not begin with a dragon tattoo. It began in a hospital in 1938. He was born with a face that the world rejected, a severe cleft palate that left him looking, in the doctor's words, like a leaf-nosed bat. His mother, Marion, rejected him instantly, the shock of his deformity driving her to scream. Abandoned to an orphanage, the infant Francis lived in a silence broken only by his own keening. He could not suckle, he could barely breathe. From his first breath, existence was pain and rejection. The true architect of the dragon, however, was his grandmother. After years of abandonment, she took him in, not out of love, but duty and bitterness. She was a woman of faded grandeur and sharp cruelty, running a home for the elderly, where Francis grew up in a forest of legs, playing quietly beneath the gaze of the senile and the dying. The atmosphere was one of decay and repression. The pivotal trauma occurred when he was 5. Taken to meet his mother, now remarried and living a pristine political life, Francis tried to speak the word he had practiced: mother. Her reaction was not an embrace, but a flight. She erased herself from the room, leaving the boy alone in the light of her vanity mirror. He was a secret that had to be kept, a stain on her new life. Back at the grandmother's house, the psychological mutilation continued. In a moment of childhood vulnerability, Francis wet his bed. He went to his grandmother for comfort, only to be met with disgust. She dragged him to the bathroom, not to clean him, but to terrorize him. She held sewing scissors to his small penis, threatening to cut it off if he ever soiled himself again. This is the seed of the dragon's rage. The conflation of sexuality, vulnerability, and the threat of castration created a fracture in his psyche that would never heal. It turned a frightened child into a man who seeks total dominance to escape his own feelings of powerlessness. The dragon's becoming. To understand the monster, one must first exhume the child, buried beneath layers of trauma and the cold, hard earth of memory. The genesis of Francis Dolarhyde's pathology traces back to the winter of 1947, a season that froze the warmth out of his grandmother's sanity. As her mind unraveled, the elderly woman who raised him transformed into an erratic tyrant, presiding over a house of senile residents with a silver bell and a decaying grandeur. She became a grotesque caricature of George Washington, her manners slipping into cruelty as she recounted her days as a belle, using her own false teeth as a terrifying object lesson for young Francis. She spoke of overcoming nature's flaws with sheer will, a lesson that would fester in the boy's psyche like an infection. The atmosphere of the house was one of confused terror. Francis, seeking solace, found fleeting comfort in the silence of the night rides with the servant couple, the Baileys. But even this innocent escape was poisoned by paranoia. When a misunderstood game of curiosity with a sharecropper's daughter involving a chicken led to a reprimand, Francis became convinced of a universal betrayal. The isolation of the child was absolute. He waited for a punishment from his grandmother that never came. A psychological torture far worse than the scissors he expected. It is here, in the suffocating dark of his childhood bedroom, that the seeds of the red dragon were sown. Driven by a warped, desperate love and a need to reclaim control, Francis fantasized about protecting his grandmother from a burglar. He took a hatchet, the weight of it heavy with lethal potential, and crept into her room. In the dizzying darkness, he stood over her sleeping form, the weapon raised. It was a moment of terrifying duality, the urge to protect indistinguishable from the urge to destroy. He did not strike, but the surge of adrenaline, the sweet and easy peace he felt afterward while washing himself, marked a permanent fracture in his soul. He had discovered the tranquility that follows the contemplation of absolute violence. This peace was short-lived. When his grandmother was finally institutionalized, the 9-year-old Francis was sent to his mother's home, a place of wealth and cruel rejection. His step-siblings, Ned and Victoria, treated him as a repulsive intruder. The psychological brutalization culminated physically when they cornered him, mocking his speech and his origins. Ned, fueled by childish malice, slammed Francis's face into a mirror repeatedly. The glass smeared with blood and mucus, shattering his reflection just as his identity had been shattered. He learned then that his face was his curse, a monstrous mask that invited pain. Decades later, the boy has vanished, replaced by a man who moves with the silent precision of a predator. In the present, while a storm batters Chicago and Will Graham wrestles with the ghosts of a hangover following Freddie Lowndes' funeral, Francis Dolarhyde sits in the quiet of his grandmother's old house. He is a creature of ritual. He watches home movies, not of his own family, but of his victims, the Jacobys, and his future prey, the Shermans. There is a profound voyeuristic horror in this act. He freezes the frames, dissecting the happiness of strangers. He observes the Sherman mother, her vitality caught in the flicker of the projector, and he feels no empathy, only a terrifying, possessive love. He calls it the glory. He is not merely a killer, he is a force of transformation. The great red dragon, an image birthed from a William Blake painting he saw in Time magazine, has become his avatar. He believes he is becoming something divine, something that transcends the human limitations of the Francis he despises. To facilitate this dark communion, Dolarhyde requires a new tool. He needs to see in the dark, to be with his victims while they sleep, invisible and omnipotent. This necessity drives him out of his solitude and into Beta Chemical, a subsidiary of his workplace. He seeks infrared film, a medium that captures heat and life in the pitch black. It is in the sterile, light-locked environment of the darkroom that he meets Reba McLean. The setting is ironically perfect. Total darkness is the only place Dolarhyde feels truly safe from judgment, for Reba is blind. Her inability to see his face disarms his usual defenses. There is a strange, crackling tension in their interaction. Reba, a woman of fierce independence and sharp wit, navigates her world with tactile precision. She treats Dolarhyde not as a pariah, but as a man. When he offers her a ride home, the dynamic shifts. The van becomes a capsule of intimacy. Dolarhyde, usually paralyzed by the gaze of others, finds himself staring at her freely, drinking in the sight of her exposed neck and the vulnerability he perceives. Yet this is not a simple romance. It is a predator toying with the idea of mercy. Inside her duplex, the domestic normalcy is alien to him. They share a slice of pie and a gin and tonic, but the air is thick with unvoiced danger. The pivotal moment arrives when Reba, seeking to understand the silence of her companion, asks to touch his face. It is a request that would usually trigger Dolarhyde's murderous rage. He allows it, but his mind flashes to violence. As he holds her wrist, he hallucinates the act of biting her hand off, the crunch of bone and the spray of blood, the dragon's impulse surfacing against the man's restraint. He controls the urge barely. He guides her hand, allowing a fleeting connection before retreating into the night. Reba is left with the impression of a shy private man, unaware that she has just shared a drink with a monster on the precipice of his terrifying becoming. She listens to her music, cherishing her independence, while Dolarhyde returns to the darkness, the infrared film in his possession, ready to capture the heat of dying stars in the eyes of his next victims. The dragon is awake, and he is hungry for the light, the touch of the beast. The atmosphere in Chicago has curdled into a palpable dread. We find ourselves 11 days away from the next full moon, and the city is living under the tyranny of a countdown. The media, feeding on the panic, treats the impending date like a gladiatorial event, while the police force is trapped in a loop of futile motion. There is a terrifying irony in the public response. As fear rises, so does a morbid fascination. Horror movies play to packed houses, and street vendors peddle merchandise mocking the killer. It is a society trying to laugh at the darkness, because the alternative is to scream at it. Inside the investigation, the mood is one of stagnation. Jack Crawford and the police hierarchy are performing the theater of authority, holding press conferences where nothing is said, simply to show the public that the federal government hasn't abandoned them. But real police work, when it lacks fresh meat, turns cannibalistic. It goes over the same ground until the earth is scorched. Will Graham, trying to escape the noise and the static of the task force, retreats to the silence of an unused jury room. This setting is symbolic. Graham sits in a place designed for judgment, surrounded by the silent accusations of the dead. He has turned the room into a shrine of evidence, with photographs of the Leeds and Jacoby families staring back at him. Graham and Crawford engage in a desperate deductive exercise regarding the abduction of Freddie Lowndes. By analysing the timeline of Lowndes' injuries, the difference between the initial blow to the head and the later mutilation, they realise the killer had to drive Lowndes somewhere. They draw a geographic circle of roughly 6 hours around Chicago. The dragon is within this radius. He is close. But Graham isn't just looking for a map. He's hunting for a psychological bridge. He needs to know why these specific families were chosen. He suspects a medical connection, perhaps a shared surgery or a wandering hospital orderly, grasping for any thread that ties the victims together. Meanwhile, the monster is evolving. Francis Dolarhyde, flush with the power of his transformation, watches the news with the arrogance of a god. He sees the police flailing and feels a cold, metallic superiority. He is no longer just a man. In his mind, he is the dragon. However, a dangerous fracture is forming in his psyche, triggered by his infatuation with Reba McClane. He wants to share his glory with her, but he knows she cannot see his visual magnificence. He needs a different medium. This desire manifests in one of the most surreal and haunting sequences in the saga. Dolarhyde takes Reba to the zoo, arranging a private session with a sedated tiger. Here, the narrative delves into deep sensory duality. For Dolarhyde, standing in the back, sweating and trembling, this is a visual feast of power. The great orange and black beast rendered helpless. For Reba, it is a tactile revelation. Guided by the zoo staff, she runs her hands over the sleeping predator. She smells the sawdust and the animal musk. She feels the coarseness of the tongue and the terrifying density of the muscle beneath the fur. She touches the lethal teeth, unaware that she is currently dating a predator far more dangerous than the one on the table. Dolarhyde watches this proxy intimacy with intense voyeurism. Reba is touching the beast, accepting the beast, just as he wishes she could accept the dragon inside him. It is a moment of profound, twisted romanticism, where violence and tenderness occupy the same space. The emotional high of the zoo visit carries over to Dolarhyde's home. The gothic atmosphere of his grandmother's house, usually a place of torment, is temporarily softened by Reba's presence. She navigates his world with her other senses, complimenting him based on descriptions she's heard from others, calling him strong and neat. These words are a balm to his lifelong insecurities about his appearance. For the first time, Dolarhyde allows himself to be vulnerable. The sexual encounter that follows is fraught with psychological peril. As they become intimate, Dolarhyde is terrified. He hallucinates that the dragon is watching, jealous of this human connection. He fears his own heart, which hammers against his ribs like a trapped bird. Yet the act is completed without violence. For a brief, shining window of time, Francis Dolarhyde silences the dragon. He feels human. He feels saved. But the morning light brings a brutal return to reality. Waking alone, Dolarhyde panics. The split in his mind widens into a chasm. He hears the voice of the dragon speaking to him directly, commanding him, "Francis, come here." This is a critical escalation in his psychosis. The dragon is no longer just a feeling. It is a separate auditory entity demanding obedience. The bliss of the night before evaporates into paranoia. He fears Reba might have found his secrets, the tapes, the layout of the house. He rushes her away, desperate to sever the connection before the dragon takes over completely. The fragility of his human facade is shattered at a gas station on the drive home. When a sullen attendant disrespects Dolarhyde and leers at Reba's legs, the violence explodes. Dolarhyde doesn't just confront the man, he nearly annihilates him. He bends a metal oil spout with his bare hands and terrorizes the attendant with a lethal, focused rage. It is a stark reminder that while Reba may have touched Francis's heart, she has not cured his madness. The dragon is merely waiting behind the eyes, ready to kill at the slightest provocation. Back in the world of the investigators, the horror deepens. Graham receives a package, a cassette tape recorded by Freddie Lowndes before his death. Listening to it is an exercise in torture. The tape captures the methodical destruction of Lowndes' will. Graham hears the reporter forced to recant his lies and praise the dragon's splendor. But the true psychological knife twist comes when the dragon, speaking through Lowndes, addresses Graham directly. The killer describes exactly how he will break Graham's spine, citing the specific anatomical landmarks. It is a message of intimate, knowledgeable cruelty. Compounding this psychological assault is a letter from Hannibal Lecter. Even from his cell, Lecter manages to seep into Graham's mind. He congratulates Graham on Lowndes' death, insinuating that Graham secretly enjoyed it. Lecter mocks the concept of morality, comparing the killer's actions to the random cruelty of God, who drops church roofs on worshippers. Lecter's goal is clear. He wants Will to admit that they are the same, that the thrill of the hunt and the kill is universal. Graham, exhausted and fraying at the edges, has to fight the urge to agree with the monster. However, amidst the despair, the machinery of investigation finally clicks. Graham, obsessing over the probate records of the victims, notices a discrepancy. In the Jacoby family's files, he finds insurance listings for high-end home movie equipment, a projector and a camera that were not found in the wreckage of their home. They weren't in storage, and they weren't in the bank vault. They are simply gone. This is the pivotal realization. The silver frames are missing, likely melted down, but the camera equipment is the key. Graham realizes the killer isn't just taking trophies. He is taking the memories. He is taking the images. The connection between the families wasn't a doctor or a shared acquaintance. The connection is that they were both captured on film. Graham immediately moves to track the missing equipment, hoping that if the son of the murdered family didn't steal it, the dragon did. The hunt has shifted from a search for a person to a search for the stolen eyes, through which the killer views his prey. The net is tightening, but the dragon is awake, and he is listening. The consumption of the dragon. In the suffocating heat of a dusty attic, the sound of iron plates clanking against the floor marks the rhythm of a fracturing mind. Francis Dolarhyde is pushing his body to its absolute limit, lifting weight he has never lifted before, driven by a desperation that transcends mere physical exercise. This is a ritual of strength, an attempt to fortify himself against the entity that shares his skin. But the great red dragon is not impressed by human exertion. It speaks to him, not from the corner of the room, but from the dark recesses of his own psyche. The voice is rasping, violent, and undeniable. It demands to know who Dolarhyde is thinking about. We see here the terrifying duality of Dolarhyde's existence. He is trying to protect Reba McLean, the woman who has inadvertently introduced humanity into his desolate world. He calls her Mrs. Sherman to deflect the dragon's attention, a pathetic attempt to offer up a substitute victim. But the dragon sees through the lie immediately. It mocks Dolarhyde's affection, weaponizing the term little buddy, the nickname Reba uses, and twisting it into a sneer of contempt. This interaction reveals the dragon's jealousy. It allows no other bonds. To enforce submission, the entity commands Dolarhyde to humiliate himself, forcing him to wear the dentures, the dragon's teeth, and threatening to tear Reba apart. Dolarhyde, broken and terrified, capitulates to the monster's strength to buy Reba time, lifting the heavy barbell as a tribute to his dark half. The psychological toll of this internal war manifests the following morning. Dolarhyde attempts to maintain his facade of normalcy, driving his van toward the film lab, but the center cannot hold. On a bridge over the Missouri River, reality dissociates. He stops in traffic, paralyzed by a collapsing sense of self. He flees to a nondescript motel, a sterile purgatory, where he contemplates the only escape that might guarantee Reba's safety: suicide. He rigs a noose in the bathroom, staring into the abyss of his own mortality. It is a moment of profound existential horror, the realization that his death is the only way to stop the becoming. However, a flicker of agency remains. He does not want to die a victim. He wants to choose. Rejecting the noose, he decides to run. He races back to his grandmother's house, a place of historical trauma, to gather supplies, money, weapons, and false identities. Even as he frantically packs, the dragon screams at him from the posters on the wall, a visual hallucination of judgment. A phone call from Reba interrupts the panic. Her voice, concerned and normal, stands in stark contrast to the madness consuming him. He feigns illness, cutting the connection to the one thing keeping him human, and flees the house, driving toward the airport. Dolarhyde's destination is New York, specifically the Brooklyn Museum. This journey is a pilgrimage, a perverse quest for communion. He believes that if he can confront the external source of his obsession, William Blake's original watercolor painting, he might gain dominance over the internal voice. He stalks the museum corridors with the precision of a predator, hiding weapons beneath his clothes. When he finally gains access to the research room and the painting is revealed, the reality shocks him. The great red dragon and the woman, clothed with the sun, is small. Physically, it is just paper and pigment. Yet, the colors possess a vibrancy that vibrates in his mind. He sees the woman caught in the dragon's tail and sees Reba. In a singular act of blasphemous consumption, Dolarhyde attacks the curator, knocking her unconscious. He does not steal the painting. He destroys it. He tears the centuries-old artwork apart and eats it. This is not simple vandalism. It is a sacramental act. By digesting the dragon, he believes he is absorbing its power, internalizing the deity to control it. He flees the museum, shedding his disguise in the botanical gardens, believing he has finally altered the terms of his becoming. He thinks he has swallowed the god to silence it. While Dolarhyde engages in his dark communion, Will Graham is in Chicago, sifting through the wreckage of the past. The investigation has been a slow, grinding process of deduction, But Graham's empathy, his ability to think like the killer, finally yields a breakthrough. Watching the home movies of the murdered families, Graham notices a discrepancy involving a basement door at the Jacoby house. The killer had brought bolt cutters, implying he expected a padlock. However, the door had been changed to a deadbolt system months prior. This logic dictates that the killer had cased the house long before the murders, during a time when the padlock was still there. Graham's eyes scan the film artifacts, moving from the content of the movies to the physical reels themselves. He finds the label, Gateway Film Laboratory, St. Louis, Missouri. It is the connection they have been searching for. The realization strikes with the force of a physical blow. The killer isn't just watching these families, he is processing the very films that capture their happiest moments. The predator is the technician. The net begins to tighten. Jack Crawford mobilizes immediately, flying to meet Graham. The pieces of forensic evidence are converging. A fingerprint found on the museum pass Dolarhyde used in Brooklyn matches a partial print found on the eyelid of a victim in the Leeds household. The scope of the manhunt narrows to the employees of Gateway. Dolarhyde returns to St. Louis, exhausted but feeling a strange, triumphant calm. He believes the ritual in the museum has worked. He drives to the lab, intending to pick up Reba, hoping that his consumption of the dragon has bought him the freedom to love her without destroying her. But as he approaches the facility, the illusion of safety shatters. He sees the vans. He sees the police. And then he sees Will Graham. The shock is absolute. He watches from the shadows as the men hunt for him inside his workplace. The realization that he has been identified strips away his newfound confidence. He is not a god who has conquered his demon. He is a fugitive. He retreats to his van, the metal sanctuary that has become his cage. As he drives away, the silence he fought so hard to achieve is broken. The dragon speaks again. The act of eating the painting did not kill the beast. It merely fed it. The voice mocks his foolish hope, deriding his betrayal. Dolarhyde is left speeding into the darkness, the authorities closing in from the outside, and the monster fully awake and enraged on the inside. There is no choice left. The becoming is accelerating, and the dragon demands its due, the burning of the dragon. The darkness that had been stalking Reba McLean finally materialized, not as a phantom in a nightmare, but as a violent intrusion into her quiet evening. It began with the brutal termination of a loose end, Ralph Mandy. He was merely a bystander, a man who had offered Reba a ride and a moment of affection, but to the watcher in the shadows, his presence was a betrayal. Francis Dolarhyde, consumed by the jealous rage of the Red Dragon, executed Mandy with the cold efficiency of a predator. 3 silent shots, leaving the body hidden in the shrubbery like discarded refuse. This wasn't just murder. It was the removal of an obstacle to Dolarhyde's possessive fantasy. When Dolarhyde tricked his way into Reba's home, the terrifying duality of his psyche was on full display. He was Dee, the shy man she liked, but he was also the dragon, a force of inevitable destruction. The kidnapping that followed was a descent into sensory hell for Reba. Blind, bound, and gagged, she was forced to rely on smell and sound, detecting the terrifying cocktail of chloroform and gasoline. She was being transported not just to a different location, but into the heart of Dolarhyde's madness. Inside his house, the psychological fracture within Dolarhyde widened into a chasm. He wasn't merely a sadist. He was a man at war with his own becoming. He confessed to Reba that the dragon wanted her, that he had tried to save her by giving the dragon others, the families in Birmingham and Atlanta. But it wasn't enough. This is the tragic paradox of Francis Dolarhyde. He sought to possess Reba to humanize himself, yet that very human connection threatened the supremacy of the dragon entity he worshipped. He prepared to burn the house, a symbolic act of apocalyptic cleansing, intending to take Reba with him to prevent the dragon from biting her to death. Reba, however, possessed a survival instinct that Dolarhyde had underestimated. Faced with the promise of a shotgun blast or immolation, she navigated the darkness of her blindness and the chaos of the fire. She played into his delusions, just enough to survive. As the house erupted into an inferno, Dolarhyde staged his final act of theatre. A shotgun blast, a heavy thud, and silence. To Reba, and soon to the arriving authorities, it appeared that the monster had destroyed himself in a final paroxysm of guilt and flame. She escaped the blaze, crawling through the grass, believing she had felt his shattered head, believing the nightmare was over. The aftermath was a study in false security. The forensic evidence seemed irrefutable. A body was found, burned beyond easy recognition, but wearing Dolarhyde's grandmother's antique vulcanite dentures, a distinct archaic dental signature. A watch was found. The FBI, led by Jack Crawford and the explosives expert Ainsworth, sifted through the ashes and concluded that the red dragon had been consumed by his own fire. For Will Graham, this signaled the end of the hunt. There was a tender final meeting with Reba, where he assured her that her kindness had likely stalled the killer's hand, saving lives. It was a moment of grace in a grim narrative, allowing Graham to finally turn his gaze south, back to Florida, back to Molly and her son Willie. But the psychological toll of the investigation had changed the landscape of Graham's domestic paradise. The reunion was marred by an unspoken distance. Willie, the boy, was cold, sensing the darkness Graham had brought back with him. The beautiful isolation of the Florida Keys, once a sanctuary, now felt fragile. They tried to heal with fishing trips and routine, but the shadow of the dragon is long. The shattering of this illusion came on a sun-drenched beach. Dolarhyde had not died in the fire. The great red dragon was a master of deception. He had murdered a gas station attendant named Arnold Lang, a man with a similar build, and used his body as a stand-in. He had placed his own dentures in the victim's mouth, a grotesque forgery meant to fool the world. While the police sifted through ashes in St. Louis, Dolarhyde was alive, watching and waiting. The confrontation in the dunes was primal and terrifyingly fast. Graham, the empathetic hunter who understood the mind of the killer, was physically outmatched by the sheer brutality of the dragon. He was stabbed in the face, the knife crunching into his cheekbone, his body ripped open. The intellectual game was over. This was a visceral fight for survival. In a bitter twist of irony, it wasn't the profiler who stopped the beast, but the mother. Molly, wielding the fierce protective instinct that Dolarhyde had perverted in his own life, hooked the killer in the face with a fishing lure and then, finding Graham's gun, shot the dragon dead. The monster who sought to change families was finally destroyed by one he tried to annihilate. As Graham lay in the intensive care unit, recovering from wounds that would leave him permanently scarred, the full scope of Dolarhyde's cunning was revealed. The killer had utilized every resource, from the blind trust of a woman to the anonymity of a stranger, to orchestrate his own mythic end. But even in death, the darkness lingered. A letter arrived from the insane asylum, from Hannibal Lecter. "I hope you won't be very ugly," Lecter wrote, a final stinging barb from the man who had set the dragon in motion. Lecter remained the orchestrator of pain, safe in his cell, delighting in the carnage. In the narcotic haze of recovery, Graham's mind drifted back to a memory of the Shiloh battlefield. He realized then the true nature of the world he hunted in. Nature, the green machine, was not cruel. It was simply indifferent. It witnessed the slaughter of the Civil War and the predation of a snake with the same dispassionate beauty. Mercy and murder were not inherent to the world. They were human inventions, manufactured in the evolved parts of the brain. Dolarhyde was gone, but the capacity for such madness remained woven into the human fabric. We are the ones who make the horror, and we are the ones who must endure it. The dragon was dead, but the scars on Graham's face and on his soul would remain as a testament to the fact that looking into the abyss always exacts a price. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe to Dark Realities for more deep dives into the shadows.